Hello, everybody, and welcome to the information session for the Early Support for Infants and Toddlers Request for Qualifications. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I'm Liz Espinosa-Snow, and I'm on the Prenatal to 5 team in King County, and I'm leading the Request for Qualifications process. I'll be joined by my colleagues Wendy Harris, the Prenatal to 5 team lead, and Debbie Donnellan, who's the Early Support for Infants and Toddlers lead. I'll also be joined by Sarah J. Sanford from the evaluation team from Best Starts for Kids. So moving on to the agenda, we anticipate having about an hour together today. And during this time, we'll be doing an overview of Best Starts for Kids. We'll be reviewing the key elements for the request for qualifications, and then we'll have time for a question and answer period. For the question and answer period, you may type answers throughout the webinar or at the end, and we'll read them aloud and answer them at the end. We do have you all muted, I believe. At the end, we'll unmute you so that you can ask questions. And even though I unmute you, you'll have to unmute yourself as well. So just keep that in mind. So doing a Best Starts for Kids overview, the vision of Best Starts for Kids is wanting to see more babies born healthy, more kids thrive, and more young people grow up to be happy, healthy, successful adults. This is a really straightforward vision, but it's the most comprehensive approach towards this work in the country. And Best Starts for Kids is shaped by an equity and social justice lens, which means that Best Starts for Kids recognizes that persistent inequities exist, especially by race and place, and that in many cases are getting worse and threatening collective prosperity of families in our city and county. Best Starts for Kids is working to invest in organizations that are reflective of and embedded in the communities they serve, and those that recognize and address disparities and disproportionalities, and the strengths, assets, and ingenuity communities possess in the face of these inequities. As a result of these persistent and intensifying inequities, BSK will focus on investments where the inequities are greatest in order to help dismantle them. And how Best Starts for Kids does this is through promotion, prevention, early intervention, and policy and systems change. The Early Support for Infants and Toddlers program, also known as ESIT, combines promotion, prevention, and early intervention. So what does this investment look like in practice? Best Starts for Kids invests on average $65 million per year, and it's an overall cohesive strategy with 4 different focus areas. The first is investing early, which is for investing early before age 5. There's sustaining the gain, which is making investments at critical points before age 24. Healthy communities, ensuring that all children and youth have opportunities to live in thriving homes, schools, and communities. And data and evaluation, finding out what's going well so we can do more of it. As you might guess, the ESIT request for qualifications that we're reviewing in this conference lives in the investing early bucket, which is 50% of levy investments. So now that we've done a brief review of the Best Starts for Kids information, we're going to move into the specific request for qualifications information. This request for qualifications is brought to you by King County's Developmental, Disabilities, and Early Childhood Supports Division and Best Starts for Kids. And we're seeking new qualified organizations to provide early support for infants and toddler services as a full service provider, deaf, hard of hearing provider, or infant mental health provider. And we'll discuss those a little bit more shortly. What is early support for infants and toddlers, or ESIT? The relationship between a child and caregiver is at the heart of the ESIT program, from the way that services are provided to the essential role of parents. ESIT builds upon family strengths by providing coordination, supports, resources, and services to enhance the development of very young children with delays and disabilities through everyday learning opportunities. The program provides comprehensive services and supports to enhance a child's development, help parents understand how to help their child grow and develop. It's also tailored to meet a child and family's individual needs, and it's available to all eligible children ages birth to 3 with developmental delays or disabilities and their families, regardless of income. Who receives ESIT services? Eligible children are birth to 3 years old, and they have a 25% delay in one or more area, which you can see in the little picture on the side, or they have a diagnosis with a high probability of developmental delay, or an evaluation team uses informed clinical opinion to determine this. The 25% delay in one or more of the 5 assessment areas include cognitive. Would you go back one slide? Thank you. And one of the 5 areas, which include cognitive, physical, self-help, language, or social emotional. And for example, they can also be in a sub-area, which an example might be expressive language, which is talking, but not receptive language, which might be listening and understanding. And what are ESIT services? Everybody who receives ESIT services gets a family resources coordinator and initial and ongoing assessments. Then the most frequent services are developmental services in individual education, speech therapy, motor therapy, which can be occupational or physical therapy, and feeding therapy and or nutrition services. These are the most frequent services, and there are other services that must be provided as well. And if you want to review the details about the services that are provided under ESIT, please review the document called 17 Part C Services, which is in the RFQ library in Zoom Grants. Children learn best through play and in the context of relationships, so ESIT services focus on working with children and families in their daily routines. And that happens at home, at childcare, or in the community with typically developing peers. I'm going to hand the presentation off to Wendy Harris, the Prenatal to 5 team lead, to discuss more information about becoming an ESIT provider and some of the funding. So.
Hi. So this request for qualifications is open to a variety of types of organizations, nonprofit organizations, community-based, tribes or tribal organizations, schools, school districts, public or governmental agencies serving King County, partnerships and collaborations. And this particular request for qualifications is seeking new providers, especially, or in some cases, an existing provider who wants to add a provider type could also apply. So existing full service provider who wanted to also become a deaf, hard of hearing provider would need to apply this way. An existing deaf, hard of hearing provider who wanted to become a full service provider would need to apply this way. Or an existing provider of any kind who wanted to become an infant mental health provider outside their catchment area could use this request for qualifications to apply. I'm going to talk now about the various types of funding that are available both through King County. There's some braided funding available through King County, and there's additional types of funding. The 3 types of funding available through King County, and it's done in a unified spreadsheet billing process, are Child Development Services, which comes through the Developmental Disabilities Administration, from them through King County to ESIT contractors. Part C funds, which come from the Department of Community, Children, Youth, and Families at the state through King County to ESIT providers, and then Best Starts for Kids ESIT funding also comes through the county. So this funding is per child, per month, and related to services provided. There are 3 other sources of funding that the applicants or that ESIT contractors need to be able to access. One is Medicaid or private insurance. And that's for any services that might be billable. The agency would seek the family's permission to bill insurance, and if permission is granted, then the agency would bill the family's insurance for services provided. And that's just for the allowable services. There are some services such as family resource coordination and education services that can't currently be billed to any insurance. A second type of funding that's part of the system is parent or family participation. So if a family grants permission to bill insurance, they may need to pay co-pays, co-insurance, or deductibles to the provider. However, evaluations may be billed to insurance, but the co-pays can't be billed to to families. Also, if a family doesn't grant permission to bill insurance, the family may be put on a sliding fee scale. However, anybody who is below 200% of federal poverty level for their family income, and there's some adjustments that also can be made, they aren't billed anything. The third and the largest billing source of all, the funding source of all, is school districts, and this would be the school district that each child resides in. The ESIT provider is responsible to contract with the district, or they can subcontract with another provider that already has a contract with that district in order to access that funding. And within the RFQ library, there is a document that's called ESIT Funding in King County that spells out many details. Liz already mentioned the different provider types, so I want to spend a little bit more time talking about what those provider types are. A full service provider is responsible for providing all 17 Part C services. And that list of 17 Part C services can be found in the RFQ library. A full service provider has family resource coordinator and provides most of the services. There are some services like teacher for the visually impaired that are provided countywide in using two of our providers already have those providers, so it's done in a coordinated way. A second type of provider that you can apply to become is a deaf, hard of hearing provider. Those are services that are related to the child's deaf or hard of hearing diagnosis. And a third, those deaf, hard of hearing providers primarily are providing education, individual education services with a teacher for the deaf. Third type of provider, this is a new type of provider within our system. This is an infant mental health provider. And those services would include family resource coordination and infant mental health treatment services primarily. I'll add one more thing before we switch slides, sorry. And that is that regardless of which provider an ESIT provider is, they work in coordination with the other providers that serve their catchment area or address a need that isn't being met by that provider. There is a long list of organizational requirements for this request for qualifications, and they can be found in two ways. Thanks. They are related to the federal requirements, the state requirements, and the county requirements that are from each of those funding sources that are part of how ESIT services are delivered. Each fund source brings their own set of contractual requirements, but they're kind of wrapped up into a single contract. And the federal and state requirements come from DCYF, or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families at the state. There are state requirements that are from the Department of Social and Health Services, Developmental Disabilities Administration, and there are county requirements that include both department requirements and division level requirements, as well as best starts for kids requirements. And so all of those requirements are held within the contract, and you can see the sample ESIT contract in the RFQ library. But examples of those requirements, if you pull them all together, it relates to staff training, staff credentialing or licensing, the need for background checks, the need for data security, how information is held confidentially, accounting practices, human resources practices, equity and social justice, and insurance coverage. Again, those requirements can be found in the organizational requirements section of the RFQ library, and the item after that in the ESIT contract template, it shows how those items are worded within the contract. For this request for qualifications, we have 4 priority areas that were developed by stakeholders. And as you develop your application, you'll want to think about the funding priorities. So I'm going to walk through each of the priority areas. But one thing I want to say is that it's not essential that every application meet all 4 priority areas in order to be qualified, identified qualified. Priority area 1 is ensuring equitable services by geography. The goal here is to increase ESIT provider capacity in geographically underserved areas of King County, including Vashon Island, Skykomish, Auburn, and Tukwila school districts. Priority area 2 is to ensure equitable services by race and ethnicity. This is both including ensuring countywide ESIT provider capacity to address specific cultural and linguistic needs of children and their families whose identities include Black or African American, Latinx, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. It's also to ensure provider capacity to increase culturally and linguistically relevant ESIT services for children of color in Seattle, Renton, and Tukwila school districts and those surrounding areas because there's some underservice in those particular areas. Priority area 3 is reaching and serving eligible children. County-wide, we're seeking to grow the capacity of the ESIT system to reach and serve 8% of the birth to 3 population in King County. Currently, about 4.7% of the birth to 3 population is being served by this system. Also, to increase the capacity of the ESIT system to serve young children and their families who are experiencing homelessness. And the 4th priority area is supporting social emotional well-being of infants, toddlers, and their families. With this one, we're seeking to increase the availability of infant mental health providers and access to infant mental health services to promote positive social emotional skills and relationships. And by this, we mean infant mental health treatment, but also infant mental health infant mental health informed service providers, not only treatment. Also increasing ESIT provider capacity to meet social emotional well-being of the diverse children and families in King County, especially for children and families of color. When you review the rating criteria, you will see each of these 4 priority concepts embedded. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah J. for a review of data sources and evaluation.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm going to talk real briefly about some ways you might consider incorporating data into your proposal in response to this RFP, some data sources that King County is making available. And although an evaluation plan is not part of this proposal, just give you an idea of what you can expect from us around evaluation if you are funded. So Our data team is guided by the principles of partnership, collaboration, and accessibility, and we hope that you'll see those values reflected in our work together. As you start thinking about putting together your proposal, I really encourage you to think about what's the story that you want to tell. There's organizations serving really diverse communities, and the proposal is really your opportunity to make the case for the story of your community, your organization, your capacity to do this work well in your community. So think about what kind of story is it that you want to tell about your organization and your community and your work, and then think through what kind of information will help back that story up and make it very real and concrete and compelling to reviewers. There's a ton of data out there. We'll show you a few different places to look, but in my experience, if you love data and you just go out there looking without an idea of what you're looking for, you can fall into a black hole, and if you are not a data-loving nerd, it can just be really frustrating digging around with a bunch of stuff. So I always encourage people to take a moment, think about the narrative that you'll be putting together and what's the data that's going to be most helpful in supporting that story. So what do we mean when we say data? We can go to the next slide. Data is lots of different kinds of data. Numbers often pops into a lot of folks' head first, and that's an important kind of data, but we also mean maps, pictures, and stories. So quantitative or numbers data is certainly not the only kind of data that's valued by King County, and it's certainly not the only kind of data that will be powerful in helping tell your story to reviewers. When we take in information and when we make decisions, like reviewers will be making about how they rate your application, we use our heads and our hearts. So I always think it can be especially powerful to pair together different kinds of data, like a number with a story, so that we can reach both the heads and hearts of those that we're communicating with. So when you think about data, don't just think about the numbers. You can think a lot more broadly than that. So there's quite a few sources of data out there. I'll talk about a couple today, and it's not because you're expected to use those. You're the best judge of what kind of information will help you tell your story. We just want to make sure that everybody knows what's out there and available if you do think it could be helpful for you. So there's a few listed here on this slide. I'll talk briefly about them, and then during the Q&A session, if you are interested in actually walking through some of the Best Starts for Kids indicator data so that we can see kind of how to navigate that or how to find things, we can do that during the Q&A. Feel free to just ask or put it into the chat box. So first of all, with Best Starts for Kids, we've got a bunch of different indicators related to child and family well-being. They're broken down as much as we are able to by race, ethnicity, by more specific communities within King County, and by other demographic factors. So on this link to the BSK indicators, you can find things like what % of kids have been getting developmental screenings, what % of families have the support they need in raising their kids, what % of children are flourishing and resilient as described by their parents. So there's really a ton of different data points related to young kids' well-being there. There's also communities count. It's got a shorter, more curated list of data, but it also has some text underneath each graph. So if you're more of a word person than a number person, or you don't like looking at the charts as much, communities count is a great place to start for just being able to find some writing that lays it out pretty clearly. And then community health indicators could be useful to you as well. That's a collection of over 160 different health and well-being related indicators about King County, again, broken down into as many demographic groups as we're able to. So that's some of what King County has available that could be relevant for your proposal. Sometimes we don't have a great source of local data, and you might find state or national data that's useful for you as well. That's a great alternative when there's not local stuff available. And then finally, think about your data. If you have data from your organization that shows the strength of your work in communities or shows your track record of implementing these kind of services well, that can be some of the most powerful data to consider including. So these are just some ideas. I really, again, want to emphasize that you don't need to use these data sources. And also, we'll mention again later in the webinar, but there is technical assistance available. And if you want help finding or using data in your application, technical assistance providers can be a great resource for that. Next slide. So this is just a screenshot of the Best Starts for Kids indicators page. As I mentioned, we can dig into that a little bit more during the Q&A if anybody who's on the webinar is interested in getting a demo of poking around our indicator data there. And then finally, there is some data that the team here has put together for you about ESIT services in King County. Once you are in Zoom Grants, you see this RFQ library, and this is where you can find it. Number 10, ESIT data PowerPoint, and that is also a great thing to look at. Take a look through that and see if any of it is going to help you build your proposal well. And that's specific to ESIT services provided locally. All right, so with that, I will move on and just give you a quick preview of evaluation for organizations that are funded. Again, you don't need to worry about any kind of evaluation planning as part of this proposal. But if you are awarded, Best Starts for Kids will be working with all of our ESIT providers together to create an ESIT plan for evaluation, and we'll be doing our best to coordinate this with the data that you're already collecting, data that you might already be using and reporting, so that it's as streamlined as possible, that we're looking at what's meaningful and also what's most feasible and lowest burden data to collect. But that's something we'll be working on together with funded partners, so you can kind of think about that more if you get funded, but certainly feel free to ask any questions you may have at this point. So with that, let's get to Liz, and she's going to talk through the timeline and some other aspects of the RFQ.
Great, thanks, Sarah J. So to go through the timeline for this RFQ, we have this information session, and then there will be an in-person information session on August 21st at 3. The deadline to request technical assistance from the TA providers is September 5th at 5 p.m. And the deadline to contact us with questions that we'll then post into the document in Zoom Grants is September 6th at 5 p.m. The due date for applications in Zoom Grants is September 17th at 11:59 p.m. And then we'll be reviewing and rating your responses in late September, doing interviews with applicants as needed on October 10th or 11th. And I believe that we will very likely be doing interviews with folks who submit the RFQ. We're hoping to notify people of RFQ status on October 31st, and from there we move on to contract discussions and possibly starting a contract as of January 1st, though that is flexible. The next slide. Okay. So the rating criteria for the RFQ, applications will be assessed on 2 main categories. The priority areas criteria assesses for how well you know the needs, strengths, and resources in your catchment area for the focus population, and how well you can meet the priority areas. For those 4 priority areas are geography, race, ethnicity, eligible children, and social emotional well-being. Then the other criteria relates to the organization's ability to meet ESIT requirements. So that includes alignment of the strategy and mission, and experience implementing relevant programs for similar populations, staffing, and ability to obtain federal, state, and local ESIT requirements. And you can refer to the rating criteria in the request for qualifications. The review process will be all complete applications will be reviewed and scored by a panel of community members, subject matter experts, and King County staff. And then for the budget, All applicants will need to submit a projected one-year budget. This is tied to the projected number of children that you may be serving. You'll want to include the cost of staff to provide home-based community, home or community-based ESIT services, and any other costs such as mileage or supervision. We want you to be realistic about the projected income and expenses that you think this program will have. It's also okay to identify gaps. We won't necessarily be able to fill what those budget gaps are, but please tell us what they are. And then there is a ramp-up period. So it's unlikely that a potential provider would hit the ground running and start on January 1st. We, King County, would be able to provide support to get your program running, and you should be factoring that ramp-up period into your budget. So technical assistance is available. Free technical assistance is available to support organizations and eliminate barriers that might prevent them from seeking funding, and that technical assistance is available through September 5th at 5 p.m. After September 5th, our technical assistance will not be able to help any further. This service is offered at no cost to applicants. Technical assistance providers can help assist in determining an appropriate fit between your organization and ESIT, provide guidance on how to best answer questions, and support application review, including editing and budget review. We encourage you to reach out to technical assistance providers as soon as possible. They may be able to accommodate last-minute requests, but the more time that you give them, the better support they'll be able to give you. Please contact one technical assistance provider at a time and give them at least 24 hours to respond before you seek another provider. And we also welcome applicants' desire to find a cultural, linguistic, and personal match. If you've connected with a technical assistance provider and decide to work with someone else, please inform the initial provider directly. And to access the free technical assistance, you can email our technical assistance providers directly. There is information, I believe, in the request for qualifications and also on the Best Starts for Kids blog. We also wanted to point out additional resources. There is one more info session that's going to be in person. It's on Wednesday, August 21st at 3 p.m. at the Renton Highlands Library, not the Renton Library. I've made that mistake before. If you have any questions, you can email them to me, esnow@kingcounty.gov, and please include request for qualifications ESIT in the subject line. That will help me sort through the rest of my emails. A reminder that you have technical assistance, access to technical assistance if you want. We've also included a glossary of terms in the request for qualifications library in Zoom grants. And we encourage you to use the checklist that's on the last page of the full request for qualifications to make sure that your application is complete. All right, so now we're finished with our presentation and we're moving into the questions and answer session. So you may type answers and we'll read them aloud and answer them, or you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask the questions verbally. We will be writing these questions down, and the final response will be in an FAQ posted next Wednesday, but we will try to answer with preliminary answers. The reason we're doing this is because there may be a lot of technical things that we need to work through. So we'll do our best to answer today, but we'll have a more full answer in a week. So I'm going to hand it over to Wendy Harris to take questions.
The question that was typed in, thank you for the question, is can you clarify the ESIT services you are seeking for deaf and hard of hearing kids and families? And typically an ESIT provider who is a deaf hard of hearing provider has somebody who's trained as a teacher for the deaf. They're sometimes trained as an audiologist or a speech therapist, but somebody who can provide home-based services that are designed for infants, toddlers, and their families to promote communication and support for the child's deaf identity, learning, and development. Next question here is, will we be paid for time required to consult and coordinate the full service agencies and the family resource coordinator? If so, what is the rate? So of the three types of providers, the full service provider has a family resource coordinator. Well, each child has a family resource coordinator. In most cases, the family resource coordinator is housed at a full service provider, or it'll be housed at the infant mental health provider. And we have family resource coordinators for children who are deaf and hard of hearing that are independent family resource coordinators. So the payment is on a per child served basis for services provided. So if one agency is serving one child, then they're paid for those services from King County and from the three other sources. If a child is served by two agencies, there's still only one family resource coordinator, but both agencies can bill King County for services provided, and they would generally split the other billing. The school district building would be split between them. So let me see if I can clarify a little bit more. So it's not a direct payment for time in any case under this program. It's a payment for a child month of services provided. Or if it's insurance billing, it's payment for that specific service that was provided. In terms of, I'm missing this question about the rate. Oh, that was the previous one. Oh, the next question is, will it be split 50-50? So can you go back to the sheet with the different fund sources and I'll explain? Thank you. So for these three fund sources that come through King County, if two providers are providing services, each provide to the same child, and that happens in different situations. It might be a full service provider plus a deaf hard of hearing provider. It might be a full service provider plus infant mental health service provider. Or it might be a child who's living in two homes and one provider can't serve both areas for some reason. For these three fund sources, each provider would get the full rate for all three fund sources. And looking at the next slide, for Medicaid and private insurance, if it's a billable service, then each provider would bill for that service. As I said earlier, there's some things that aren't billable. Family resource coordination isn't billable to insurance, and neither is our education services right now in this state. And then for school district funding, it would be one school district fund source, which is about, right now it's about $935 a month for a 10-month period. So if there are two service providers providing equal amounts of service, let's say they're each providing weekly home visits, then that $935 would be split in half. For the most part, there's a little bit more nuance to that depending on who is actually billing the school district. The person billing the school district can hold back 5% and then pass the rest of the 50% through. Yeah, or if one service provider is providing 3/4 of the total services and the other service provider is providing only 1/4 of the total services, the school district funding would be split proportionately. Here's another question. Could a behavioral health agency with expertise in deaf or hard of hearing children provide social emotional support for deaf, hard of hearing children and their families? That's a really fantastic question. Yes, we would need to think about that a little bit and whether they would only provide support for deaf, hard of hearing children and their families, or if they would be open to providing it for a larger group of children. But yes, open either. I think it is possible to have it focused on deaf, hard of hearing children and not across all children. These are great questions. Keep them coming.
Hello, this is Bonnie Olson calling on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yes. What's your question, Bonnie?
Oh, great. I think in the part of the intro, I wanted to clarify because the deadline to ask for TA is that September 5th date, but so you need to initiate by then, but we are able to help people up to the date that it's due.
Thank you, Bonnie. That is accurate. So what we know is that there's some complexity to this application. So we want to make sure that you reach out to a TA provider in enough time for them to be able to provide meaningful support to you. So you can request anytime up to September 5th, and you can continue getting support from that TA provider up to the deadline. Here's another question. Is the school district the overall facilitator of services to a child? Would a provider need to serve all eligible students in a particular school district? What about providers who may not have the ability to bill non-Medicaid insurance? Okay, we'll deal with those questions one at a time because those are really great big questions. Interestingly, the school district is the largest funder, but the development of the service plan is done with the family resource coordinator, the service provider, and the family to develop an individualized family service plan. So the school district is the largest funder, but I would not call them the overall facilitator. Do you have anything to add to that, Debbie? Second question, would a provider need to serve all eligible students in a particular school district? Another great question. A provider needs to set your catchment area, which is the physical boundaries that you're willing to accept referrals within, and those boundaries may cross school districts, or it may be a portion of a school district, and so you need to accept referrals from all families in your catchment area, regardless of school district. I'm going to try and say that one more time because I think that's a little confusing. So set your boundaries, and you need to accept referrals within your boundaries, and your boundaries may or may not relate to school district boundaries. But if you have boundaries that include, say, 3 districts, you need to have a system for contracting with all 3 of those districts. But you don't necessarily, if your boundaries don't include the whole school district, you do not have to accept all the children in that district. The third question is, what about providers who may not have the ability to bill non-Medicaid insurance? So if the provider already bills Medicaid, we may be able to provide technical assistance or support, or help an agency work towards being able to bill non-Medicaid insurance and look at what it would take to get there. If you're able to bill Medicaid insurance, chances are you would have the capacity to bill non-Medicaid insurance as well. Not sure what the barriers are, but we're open to discussing that, and I encourage you to include what the factors are in your application so that we could figure out how that barrier could be addressed. About 50% of the children across King County currently are Medicaid eligible that have been in this program. There's some areas of the county that have a higher percentage of children eligible for Medicaid. And so it sort of depends what area of the county you're in. Here's the next question. Do you know if the same pool of Medicaid funding is billed for infant mental health services within ESIT versus in behavioral health, community mental health system? Each system would also have different eligibility determination or documentation practices. Thank you for that question. We are actually working with Behavioral Health and Recovery Division to figure this out. So this is a preliminary answer. It's our understanding that if the behavioral health is billed, if Medicaid is billed through behavioral health, you wouldn't also be billing through ESIT. But you could bill for the other ESIT fund sources without billing again for Medicaid. You would only bill once for Medicaid. But we will have a clearer answer for this for you, hopefully by next Wednesday. Any other questions? If we become an infant mental health provider in ESID, will we partner with one ESID agency or with multiple ESID agencies that need infant mental health providers? Great question. It depends on your catchment area and who are the ESID providers that serve that catchment area. So if you determine a very large catchment area, there are currently 10 full service providers and 3 deaf, hard of hearing providers within our system. So you could be partnering with very many. Because we encourage parent choice within the system, we wouldn't want to set up a situation where your catchment area had 2 providers within it, 2 full service providers, but you were only working with one. Next question, is there any difference in funding for children who may be undocumented? There is not any difference in funding for children who may be undocumented. We know that the issues around public charge may have some impact on families' willingness to use early support for infants and toddler services. And so that is a dilemma that we're all dealing with right now. However, from a King County perspective, from a school district perspective, there wouldn't be any difference in willingness to fund. And there's no requirement to demonstrate documentation to access this program. What is the requirement for an infant mental health provider around participating in the initial evaluation? Or would the full service agency, ESIT agency, complete this? Who determines when an infant mental health provider should be invited to be part of the individual family service plan? Great question. And I think it depends on how the child and family is referred. If a child is referred specifically around infant mental health issues, the referral may go straight to an infant mental health agency, and the child would be evaluated by the infant mental health agency and served by the infant mental health agency. If the child is coming through a full service provider or a deaf, hard of hearing provider and already served there, and infant mental health treatment services are needed, then the evaluation would have already happened through the full service provider or the deaf, hard of hearing provider, and the infant mental health provider would be kind of an additional provider to add into the individualized family service plan.
And this is Debbie Donlin. I would just add that as this will be new if we have agencies providing infant mental health only services, and so we would work together with any new agencies and our existing providers around these processes and how they should look.
And one other thing in terms of evaluation, the evaluations within the Early Support for Infants and Toddlers program need to be conducted by 2 qualified evaluators with credentials. with 2 different sets of credentials. So if the infant mental health agency is doing an evaluation, it could be done, for example, by a social worker, and maybe it could still be done by an educator from a partner agency, or somebody else who met a different criteria than a social worker. It's possible that a family resource coordinator working for the infant mental health organization could be also have qualifications that might be different than a social worker qualification, or different than whoever the infant mental health provider's qualifications are. What is the expectation around infant mental health providers participating in ongoing staffing and consulting? I'm not sure what you mean by that question. Can you clarify? Full service agency often has a regular staffing. By that, do you mean staff people or the staffing of children? Yeah. Yes, it's our goal when any child or family is being served by more than one provider, that there is collaboration around the staffing of children's needs, and there we may need to figure out strategies to do so. Do all ESIT providers need to be fully licensed, or can they be under supervision of licensed providers? Do you want to address that, Debbie?
This might be one that's a preliminary answer that we have to come back, but my understanding is that some ESIT providers are fully licensed as mental health agencies and some are not, and they have clinicians that practice under their own individual license.
In addition, I would add that our system generally does support people who are operating under the supervision of qualified staff, and there are some supervisory requirements related to that, but it is allowable in a variety of ways with permission when somebody doesn't have the full set of qualifications. And there's a variety of ways that somebody can be an educator under supervision without meeting the full criteria, or somebody can be in their initial year before having their full qualifications and still operate with under supervision. So that is allowable, and examples of the supervision would be 1 supervised home visit a month with ongoing consultation of cases, a regular ongoing consultation of cases. Thanks for these great questions. If a family is served by multiple agencies, where would their documentation live? The ESIT system has a data management system, and there is right now the data management system, wherever the family resource coordinator is, most of the records are held with the family resource coordinator, but service providers can be assigned from a different agency. And so the service provider from the other agency can still access all the materials in the data management system. So any provider who's on the team is responsible for keeping a full file and can access that child and family's records in the data management system.
But for, like, in the example of a child and family being served by a full service agency and an infant mental health agency, the infant mental health agency would have their own notes around the clinical treatment that would not be accessible to the other parties, that would live outside of the data management system.
Most of the current providers in the ESIT system have additional electronic records that live outside of the ESIT data management system. And so that we would expect that also with any infant mental health provider. And Haruko says, very helpful, thanks. Actually, Haruko, these are fantastic questions, and we will type them up and do some written FAQs that'll be available next Wednesday. Are there any other questions before we close? I want to remind you that if you have questions between now and Friday, if this generated more questions, if you can please email Liz Snow with RFQ questions in the email header. Then we will also include them in next Wednesday's frequently asked questions packet. And then we will keep updating those every week. All righty, we are coming to the close of our time together. We know that there are a variety of new ideas built into this RFQ, and it's a really exciting system. We're really seeking to grow and strengthen the work that we provide on behalf of children and families, and we hope that you'll consider being a part of it.